To implement a program that uses aggregation and composition, we're going to define one class for the whole and define separate classes for each of the parts. For each class that contains another class, we're going to declare an instance variable inside the containing class such that the instance variable holds a reference to one or more of the contained class's objects. Right? So in this case, we're declaring a manager object called the boss. But typically for an association or for association lines with multiplicity values of a star, we're going to use an array list or some other container type class to implement the instance variable associated with that, because we need to hold multiple values of them, right? We need to hold multiple cars. We need to store multiple salespeople, right? So here you can see we have a salesperson called salesfolk, right? That's going to be an array list. We're going to have multiple cars stored in a car list or an array list. And then we're going to have one variable that stores the manager. If two classes have an aggregation relationship with non-exclusive ownership, then we're going to store the contained class object in an instance variable in the containing class. But we're also going to store it in another variable outside of the containing class so that the object can be added to another aggregation and have two different owners, right? So here, the manager, he's going to belong to some other class, and so we're going to have a reference to him or her in both of the classes, right? If two classes have a composition relationship, then we're going to store the contained class's object in an instance variable in the containing class, but do not store it elsewhere, right? So in the case of our car, nobody but the dealership owns those things, right? So this way, only the object can be part of the dealership. It can't belong to anybody else. Okay, so let's take a look at an actual program that uses all this composition and aggregation mumbo jumbo. All right, so here we have a dealership driver, and it's going to be our main program that we're going to run, right? So here we're declaring a manager, new manager, and we're passing in the name, and we've got some salespeople. We're creating new salespeople, right? And then we're creating our dealership, right? So it's given a name and it's given a manager as constructor parameters. And then we're adding people to the dealership, and then we're adding cars to the dealership, and then we're printing out the status of the dealership. All right, so that's what it's doing. So let's take a look at these individual classes so we can get a little bit more understanding of what's going on. So we'll go to manager, since that was the first class that was created. And here we just have a simple manager, and it just stores his name or her name, and a method to get the name. All right, pretty simple. It doesn't get much simpler than that. All right, let's look at the car, right? Here we have a car, and in it we have a make, right? And that's it. So we have a constructor where we pass in the make, and then we have a method to get the make. Finally, we have or not finally, but we have a salesperson, right? And we have a name and sales. And we have a salesperson constructor that sets the name, and then we also have a method to get the name. So as you can see here, none of these classes are overly complicated. And finally, we have the dealership itself, right? And it's going to import the array list because we're going to use that. Here we have the company, we have a manager, right? And we have a sales array list of salesperson called people, and we create a new array list, right? And then we have an array list of car called cars, right? And we create that new array list and set the reference to it. And then so here's our constructor for the dealership, where we're passing in the company and the manager, and we set those things equal to what those things are. We have an add car method, which is going to take whatever car we pass in and add it to our car array list called cars. And then finally, we also have the add person, which does the same thing as add car, just with people. And then finally, we have the print status, which is going to print out the manager, print out all the people and all the cars. So that's it. Pretty self-explanatory, nothing too crazy. So we're going to save it, we're going to run it, and we're going to compile it. And you can see here that we have OK used cars with Mr. Mendez as the manager, and Nicole Betts as a salesperson, and Vince Sola as a salesperson. And we've got a GMC, a Yugo, and a Dodge. Okay, so all that's all well and good, but we really didn't look at the composition and inheritance part of it, or excuse me, not inheritance, aggregation. So if we go back to the dealership, because that's really the source of these relationships, right? You can see here that we have a manager. Okay, so we have a reference to a manager object that we're going to pass in. Now, as it currently stands, this is actually a composition because this manager, as far as we know, doesn't belong to anything else, right? So it's a composition, right? We have a array list of salesperson. As far as we know, these salespeople don't belong to any other classes, so this is a composition. And the same thing with the cars, right? Now, if we have some other pieces of this program where we're going to store a reference to the car manager, well, then we're going to have a aggregation instead of a composition. So that's just how it breaks down. Hopefully you can see how this is going to work. We're gonna dig into a little bit more. We're gonna talk about inheritance, but hopefully you can see how we're adding in pieces of the bigger picture, and all these components add up to something bigger than themselves, right? We have the whole, and then we have the parts. In this case, the dealership is the whole, and the parts are the salesperson, the car, and the manager.